There we go. Okay, anyway. So using FileMaker data in web pages, part one. We do have some plans to go into further things like sending data back and doing a form submission. But I think there's a lot to kind of unpack here, so I didn't want to overload people. So this first time, we're just going to be discussing how to pull data from a FileMaker file. And for the benefit of those listening in at home, what's required? Well, obviously, you need a FileMaker server. You can't run this off FileMaker Pro. In order to configure your server, you need a fully qualified domain name. And pretty much everybody has these or can get one. I always apply them to my FileMaker servers whenever possible, because that allows you to secure it with an SSL certificate, and that's also required to use the Data API. And additionally, of course, you need a web server, which might be the FileMaker server itself, but I think the point here is you could use it on your main business domain with some other server entirely. You do need to enable the FileMaker API. It's not enabled by default, well, probably because of those requirements, the SSL certificate and whatnot. For web servers, looks like pretty much anything will do as long as you can enable PHP and you can get at the HTML documents. I think that's kind of the bare minimum for a functional web server. Could be your hosted website, could be a FileMaker server. I've got that running in a couple different places. Could be a simple NAS box. You could use a Synology box with Apache and PHP enabled. So, but yeah, the FileMaker's web publishing options. Well, there's a number of them. You can publish static web pages. You've got WebDirect, you got CWP, and the Data API can actually be accessed by a lot of different things, JavaScript, Python. But I'm not going to go into that because I don't know anything about it. But we can talk about PHP. So basically, static web page HTML. It's possible for FileMaker to generate a text file with HTML that's been generated based on data in your database. And there's various ways to export that and transfer it to your web server, but it's really not very flexible and it's not updated very often. I can kind of think of a couple possible use cases, but it's not updated at all. You'd have to manually update or have some sort of scripted update. We want data that updates instantly. WebDirect, which we looked at last month, super easy to set up, super easy to make layouts for. But the licensing is a tad pricey, and it's not really scalable for a public-facing page. You could do a lot for an internal company thing, but if the possibility exists that the public is going to have to access this, it's not very practical. And it also puts a pretty big processing load on the server. When this first came out, I had a nonprofit that used this for a parent portal, and it about choked that poor mini to death. It never quit. Man, it would drag it down, and you can see the processor just going nuts on it, trying to process just 6 or 8 users at a time. And granted, it was a Mac Mini, so I wasn't expecting a whole lot. But if you were going to roll that out widespread, you would have to have a pretty powerful server, or make use of the web worker. What do they call those? Is you can install a separate web worker server and use multiple machines, kind of as a load balancer, I guess. But anyway, but I don't think it's super practical for what we're doing here. Custom web publishing has been the standard for a long time. Uses a FileMaker API for PHP. It's not the Data API. But more recently, that's not available on the cloud servers or on the Beta Linux server. Also, the API has not been updated in a while. It kind of FileMaker gives off a vibe that it's probably going the way of runtimes and maybe some other features that are on the edge of deprecation. Also, FileMaker's server's installed version of PHP is often a version or two outdated. There could be vulnerabilities, and there are ways to update that, but it's just not that way out of the box, which is kind of a bummer.
And Dean, I think the Linux is out of beta, and still they're not putting the PHP custom web publishing in it. So
yeah, I'm pretty sure they want that to go away. Yeah,
that's what it looks like.
but fortunately, we have a solution. The Data API works well from another FileMaker file. I did a presentation last July on this. Speaking of which, did everybody get the files? Let me end sharing here. Let's see. Oh, here comes somebody else. In the chat window, do you guys see the, I loaded a zip file there.
The only thing I see from you, Dean, is that link to Confluence Bamboo thing.
Here, let me throw a couple things up now that everybody's in. Hey, Brent.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
Welcome. Sorry I didn't see you really quick here. You're just in time. Let me throw a couple files up here. There it goes. So anyway, that zip file's got some of the sample files that I'm talking about that we'll go into. There it goes. All right, let me jump back into my keynote. Anyway, so yeah, so we get down to the brass tacks, the FileMaker Data API, and we've all, well, not everybody's used it, but many people have. I've used it a lot from FileMaker files, standalone iPad files that yank data from the server, and it works pretty well for that. To help with other technologies like web, FileMaker does offer, well, they don't offer anything really, but they list a bunch of other people who have made wrappers and whatnot to kind of make this easier. It seems like a lot of those require installing Composer or some other thing on your server, which I honestly just couldn't get to work. Maybe I just don't understand it much, but so which is why I settled on this. But so if you're not how many are familiar with PHP? Have you built things with it or?
Worked with it, not built with it.
Yeah, it's an old language. I think it's been around since what, 97 or something. But it's pretty ubiquitous. It's all over the place. But in order for it to work, the web server must have PHP enabled, obviously. It's kind of just an overview of how this kind of functions. Your HTML documents contain bits of PHP code that's interpreted, and the results are sent to the web browser as HTML. PHP can get data from many different sources, SQL and various kinds of SQL. All the PHP code is processed on the server before the result is sent to the web browser. So it does put a load on the web server, but I don't think it's nothing like WebDirect. But there's tons of resources for learning about PHP if you so desire. And you don't really have to know a whole lot. You can, if you have a working web page with CSS and it looks pretty dandy and you just want to plunk in a couple pieces of data, maybe the client name or something, just those little bits of it can be PHP. And yeah, so if you're starting out, there's a couple of things that'll trip you up, but I'll try and cover a couple of the real basic things. But everything, all the code inside an HTML document is inside that less than question mark PHP, and then a question mark greater than end tag. Anything in there is considered to be PHP code, and it'll try and interpret that. Probably the first command you'll learn in it is echo, which is kind of the same as print. Other things to watch out for: every line ends in a semicolon, or you'll get a blank page or errors or other kinds of things. Like with pretty much every other language in the world, variables are set with an equal sign. Text and variables can be concatenated with periods, as in that second example down. And then the echo will print that result. So echo this text. Oof, you got it. Another good thing to know is a double slash E will comment out a line. So that's, in addition to commenting your code, it's really helpful for troubleshooting. See if you can figure out why is your page just magically blank for some reason.
I had no idea programming was this easy.
Oh, this is a real basic intro, but yeah, I mean, this would get you a page.
Yeah. I miss HyperTalk, man.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. There is some weirdness going on with quotes. Single and double quotes are kind of the same, but not exactly. For some reason, the variables that are inside double quotes are still evaluated, whereas variables inside single quotes are not. It just sounds like a good way to trip you up. I don't know what the exact meaning of that behavior is, but it's true, so it's something to watch out for. And like with FileMaker, the backslash will escape more troublesome characters. Like if you really want to have a double quote in your text, you have to escape it. And that's exactly the same as FileMaker. So
Makes me think we should practice using single quotes, right?
I think so, yeah. I think it's confusing that both of them kind of work. I just don't know what's up with that behavior. The guy who thought it up is probably long retired by now, so we can't really ask him. But to demonstrate the whole process, whoops, let's go back there. So there's your basic PHP code, and if you go to this particular web address, you'll see it. It's got the regular HTML document header, the HTML, the body. Inside there, we've got our PHP tags. We've got an echo. The web browser receives that interpreted code. You don't see any of the PHP tags in the web browser because nothing's processed on the web browser except the HTML. And then finally, over at the right, that's what the web browser displays. It's a simple line of text. These are all things that I butted my head against for years, and I'm hoping somebody can avoid a few headaches.
So the PHP occurs wherever it's placed on the page. Is that right?
It depends on how it's calculated. Because you could use PHP to calculate a div that does something weird with CSS. You can have functions, as you'll see, inside PHP that don't display anything. But very much later in the document, a little snippet of PHP might call that function and produce some text at that point. Some of the demos will show some of that a little bit. Some of the disadvantages, though, are that the files really have to be on a web server to be tested. I haven't found a way yet to kind of fake it without a server. I thought there might be a way with the PHP command line, but it's flaky and doesn't want to work. But,
Wait, you can't run it on MAMP internally on your Mac?
MAMP? I don't know. I'm not sure what MAMP is. Let's see.
I seem to remember playing around with that a couple of years ago and getting some results.
Yeah, it's an internal Apache host that you can basically turn your own computer into a mini server.
Yeah, so I've used it to run WordPress inside of the Mac without having to post it to a server. So if it's running WordPress in its own, little partition on your internal hard drive, well, then it's processing PHP.
Interesting. I'll have to look at that.
I think it stands
Yeah.
for Mac Apache. Shoot, now I forget what the other ones are. But it's an
Something
acronym for the
processor.
stamp. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, actually, I think, yeah, the P is PHP,
Oh, okay.
maybe. But then there's WAMP, that's the Windows version, and then there's XAMPP, and it's a
And there's a LAMP
cross-platform.
as well for Linux.
Mhm.
Okay.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm going to look at that. So yeah, I've always struggled with that, trying to, and I end up just putting the file on the server and dealing with it that way. But that might
And
be,
it's free.
yeah, better way for testing. Cool. Okay. Language is quite picky. Get one thing out of place and you get a big blank page with no excuse. There is an error thing you can turn on. Language seems unpopular. Seems around. Oh, people hate PHP. God, it's terrible. And it probably is, but hey, it works, I guess. But there may be easier ways to do it. Maybe JavaScript is. I just don't know. So what I wanted to look at today is actually this particular URL. Let me paste that into chat so you guys can look at it. So it uses curl inside of PHP, which Alex mentioned before. Curl is a very useful tool. Nothing has to be installed on the web server except PHP. And I did see a couple instances where curl may not be enabled by default in PHP. I think you have to get into the PHP any file in that case and enable it. But it's something that's easily Googled. It's not super hard to do if that's the case. It looks like most of the time curl is enabled. So if you're not familiar, curl is a URL transfer tool. It's good for sending data from the command line or receiving data. It's been around forever. For example, curl https dafmug.org that pulls out the basic code of our web page. So this particular example, were you all able to open that link?
Yeah.
Yes.
Basically, you set up 3 functions, so functions can be reused. You could call these functions several times in one page. Just saves you a heck of a lot of typing. Well, much like FileMaker's custom functions. If you haven't used those, they're great. Oops. The first
This
one is
is
a get
cool.
token, which takes. If you've used the FileMaker Data API in FileMaker, there's a whole palaver you have to go through to get the token first, and then and this follows the same thing. It's just using a different mechanism. The tokens are obtained by submitting your username and password encoded in base 64 and calling a certain URL, and it returns your token. And then you use the token to get your data later. It's valid for 15 minutes or until you disconnect the token. The second function it does is a get data, which is super handy. You create your URL, call this function, and it comes back with your data. It's amazing. But it does return it in a PHP array, which is not unlike a JSON object, but not quite the same either. And finally, the delete token, which is kind of optional, but it's a good idea after you've got your data to kill that token, so there's no possibility that it could be hijacked to get something else. So our basic PHP file, and I included this as a text file in that data. Nothing really special about it. It's a basic HTML document with some opening and closing PHP tags in it. That's kind of a starting point. And this is amazingly helpful. Before I knew about this, the first thing I know about I'd left out a semicolon is the page went blank when I reloaded. And try and guess what you did wrong last time, that kind of thing. If you insert these lines in there, it actually becomes helpful. And that's something you want to keep enabled during development. You probably wouldn't want to keep that enabled, when it's in production. But I guess if anything, you just don't want people to see how you screwed up. But this is a very helpful thing to drop in. So it walks you through dropping in each function at a time. So the get function first. As with FileMaker, the variable names have $signs. I think in FileMaker, when you pass parameters like that, it's semicolon separated. These are comma separated. The get data function, again, it sets up the whole mechanism that would be a lot of typing, actually, if you did this one at a time. That's what you would pass your token. Go ahead.
I said I like typing.
Oh, man.
It's the only thing I know how to do.
You're in for a lot of it then. But all this is kind of a framework. So you as a web designer, you've got an advantage on me in that you would be able to build your whole site. And you could paste in these functions and you could pick data right out of a FileMaker server with these functions to populate.
Yes, if only I understood what functions were.
Oh, yeah. Well, we'll show you a little bit later.
Yeah, I think, the truth is I need you guys a lot more than you need me.
Oh, I don't think so.
I don't know about that.
Think of the functions as just a little encapsulated mechanism. So the delete token function, it kind of sits up there at the top of the code and it doesn't do anything until somebody else calls it up and said, hey, delete this token. And then it goes and does its thing and reports, okay, I did it. What is it like, I guess? I don't know. Does anybody have a better analogy, I guess?
I think it's a good way to just like reuse bits of code. Like if you always are sorting something, like you'd write a function that could do a specific sort for you. That way you're not typing the same code 5 times throughout the page. And then if you have to make a correction, instead of editing it 5 times, you just go to the top of the page and edit your function.
Yeah, that's probably the most succinct thing. It's basically a little specialized reusable mechanism, I guess, kind of. So you would paste those 3 functions in your code. This is before we've even tried to put anything on the page. The host variable, just as with using the FileMaker Data API and FileMaker, there's slightly different forms of URL that you would use depending on what you're doing. Like the get token URL ends in /sessions. A query ends in /_find. There's a couple other ones, but I didn't want to bog it down too much. But these are the exact same format as you'll see in the FileMaker Data API documentation. You do have to fill out your own server address, your own layout names, your own database names. But you'll see how it works here in a moment. So in order to get data, well, we've got to get that auth token first. And part of your code It wants to set up those parameters before it calls the function. It needs a host, needs the username and the password, and in this case, it does. The payload's empty. We're not doing a query or anything like that. So the first section of that is, sets up your host variable, HTTPS:// server / yada yada yada. Does need the database name, and I have made it work with spaces inside the database name, but it's just slightly easier if you can avoid that. Otherwise, you have to put the %20 in for spaces or other special characters. And of course, there's a risk to hard coding a password like that. It's possible somebody could pull your files and get that. So as a result, don't use a full access account in your web files. Use something with just the bare minimum of privileges. It might even be possible to, if you're just reading, don't give them any write or delete access. That way that there's very little mayhem that account could be used to perform. Also, I wouldn't use FMNet either. Go ahead.
The ones that we used as Z code, which I don't have very much like experience with, but like sometimes with ProMaps, you have to set up a PHP, and part of that process is like setting up a very special account that has like almost no access to anything.
Right. Yeah, and it's just a good practice because it's going to be written down somewhere, and it's not impossible that somebody could hack the file and snag it because it's in plain text. Yeah, and don't use the FMNet access privilege on that account. So even if they do get it, they can't use it to get into your file. But do make sure you have access via FileMaker Data API. That's the important one. So getting the auth token. That's what this line of code is what calls that function, Tim. So token, $token equals get _ token. It's just setting that variable with that function, and we already set up the host, the username, password. The function does all the rest and puts the value inside the variable name token. Proof, you're ready to go.
So a token is some kind of pre-wrapped lozenge of some sort?
Yeah, it's what you get back when you send a valid username and password to a FileMaker server and tell it, I want access to data here. Here's my username and password. And it's encoded in a certain way. The FileMaker server takes that username and password and says, oh, okay, well, you'll be allowed. Okay, you're allowed to get data for 15 minutes, but you have to use this token.
It's like a ticket to get in.
Yeah, kind of like a ticket to see a 15-minute movie. And while that token's active, you can do anything that user account is allowed to do. You could pull data, you could do queries, you could add records, delete records if it had permission. It may become a little more clear here in a moment. So we called the function to get the token. Now we have an auth token. Let's use it to query some data. As I mentioned, the host variable, the server's URL is slightly different now. It's going to end in /find. The URL also needs a layout name in this case. So we have to set the host variable. And we also have to set some JSON data as the payload to do the query. And there's the format right there. It's query : and then there's one object for field name. In this particular field name, find this value. I got a little better. Here's a better example. So if I wanted to access a file named events on a server named my server, using the layout in FileMaker named API layout, and I wanted to find all records where a field named available for web is set to yes, that's what my data would look like. I'd set the host to the find URL with the correct database name and layout name. I'd set the payload to that JSON query data. And then if everything's correct and I found some data, it's going to return that. It's going to return the data it finds on that API layout. So if you use the FileMaker Data API in FileMaker Go, you're already familiar with this. And this is also true in custom web publishing. Kind of the best deal is to make individual layouts in FileMaker that have just the fields you want. And it will, because the queries return only the fields. You could have 100 fields in that table, but if there's only 5 of them on that layout, it's only going to return those 5 values, which is good because you don't want to just spew data from wherever. You just want to get what you need. So then we call the get data. Request equals get data followed by our parameters that we made. The host, the token, the payload, which is the query that we set up. And calling that function sets the value of that to the request variable. And there's another thing that we'll see if you, is I'm calling a var dump here on that variable so that you obviously don't want that in a production environment, but if you're just starting out with this is helpful to see what you're getting back. And then later you would just disable that line once you're familiar enough with it. And I've got an example here in a moment. So after we got our data, it's in that array. We don't need that token anymore. So we set up our host variable again, our host URL, which again is slightly different than the find URL. It's quite similar to the sessions. But yeah, and then you call the function token delete and equals delete token and the host address, poof, your token is gone. It's no longer valid to get any more data. That's just a security thing. It would expire after 15 minutes. But so sample files, I put in 2 of them on. Let's see if I can copy these out. Oops. So that's and the source and the code for this is included in that document, in that zip file. So when you run that query, this is what we get back. It looks like difficult to read massive data, and it is, but it's kind of in the same format and structure that the JSON data would be if you did an API call. Well, because it is an API call, but it's just not as easy to pretty up and interpret. So the first thing you need to know is when you got your data back, was it valid? Was it a successful query? Did we get any records? Just like with if you make, well, for the API call, it's sending back a code as whether it was an error or was it successful? And that information is kind of at the bottom of that JSON data. We're looking inside messages. We're looking for the code field and what is its value. So in this particular case, messages code is 0. So there was no error. We're perfectly good. So we create a variable named code. We know the path to the data starts with the request variable that we did. With PHP, the dash greater than kind of indicates the next step, kind of like the dot does in JSON, in the JSON path. And it also makes use of the bracket number to pull the item out. So we're telling code to be the thing in request that's under the first messages object in the field name code, and that equals 0. And once we know that there's no error code, then we know it's safe to proceed to start to parse out our data. And I think it's also helpful to pull out the message that goes along with code. That just keeps you from having to do a Google search on what that weird error code was. It might tell you something like, I don't know, SMTP error or invalid user or invalid logins, something like that. So once I have those two values and variables, part of my PHP code will echo, code colon what the code was, then a break message, and then whatever the message value was. And the result, in this case, since it went correctly, is code is 0, message is okay. I know I've got data. And now I know it's safe to go and try and parse some of it. If the code came back anything other than 0, we'd want to not parse data and just put up some kind of message like, ooh, bummer, there's an error. And for using that, we'll use a little bit of logic in PHP. So I can do all the same logic functions, including if statements. The format's a little different, but so if my code double equals 0, that's how it distinguishes between a logical operation and some kind of value operation. So if the code double equals 0, then hey, we got records. Otherwise, we just want to print an error code and not have everything blow up when we try and parse data that doesn't exist. So one thing that would be necessary for parsing data is finding out, well, how many records do we get? And we can find that too, because it's in the data. It's in request, response, data info, return count. That gives us a number of records that we got back. So what we want to do here is, I'm just keeping it super simple with no CSS, but we're going to make a table, has an event date, an event name, and some event info. And all of this is coming from, oops. I'll bring up the database here.
Dean, I gotta say, this is exactly what I was hoping to see. So this is awesome. Thank you.
Cool, you're welcome. So that data is coming from this FileMaker database. It's living on my server, Agreebo. It's really basic right now. But of course, this has practical applications because we could link this up to a page on our new database, and it could call out the latest events. And if I don't want this one to show up anymore, I can just make it inactive. When I'm ready for next month's event, let's say it's going to be July 2nd. Wow. Okay. I make that active. Let's see, I'm going to share my whole screen again. Let's put events 1 here. There's the latest record that I just created in the FileMaker database. What to do about web stuff. I go back over here.
Brilliant.
August 6th. Make it active because it's only searching for active events. Refresh the page. Now I've got 4 events. 4 events.
Yeah, but it shows up after May.
Yeah, I probably.
They show up in the other order.
Yeah, there are sorting functions. I just didn't want to make it too hairy yet. I think as part of the PHP command, you can tell it you can give it a sort order, like sort by. Well, actually, no, it's in the data API query, whatever that payload is. You can add a sort. You can add a script that runs after it, or I think there's a pre-script. There's a couple different ways you can modify that. So yeah, if I did want to make that the latest one, I would give it a sort command when I queried the data, and it would come back in that order. So your web browser doesn't have to sort this, because big data sets, that could take a while. Let's see, let's get back to here. And go, thank you. Of course, I just showed up all my cool stuff, but we'll walk through a little bit about how to build the table. We know we've got that there, and we've got this giant mass of data. We need to tell PHP to walk through that. And we know how many messages there are, or how many records there are. And I want to build a table that has a table row for every record. So we'll use PHP and the echo command to start building our HTML. And you know, Tim, you're familiar with this. You do it in your sleep.
I love HTML. I understand it.
This is all HTML, except I'm kind of telling a different language to produce some for me. And because I've got some special data I want HTML to put in here. But this opening part doesn't have anything variable in it. It's just, we need to start our table. We need to put a table head and make our table row with our event name, we can set up our widths, we can set up our CSS, however you're doing that, which I don't frankly know a lot about. But that's the stuff.
When you say echo, what it's going to do is return the entire table as defined by what you've got there. And why don't you have a closing tag for the table?
I do, but we're building it one line at a time.
Oh, I see. Okay, sorry.
No, you're right. No, you're right to question, but it's so echo I'm telling PHP. That's what PHP's echoes means print. I mean, if you remember old AppleSoft,
Yep.
command question mark hello world would print hello world. That's kind of what echo does. It just exports that line of text, whatever follows in the quotes. So I'm echoing my first line, table. I'm echoing my table row, my table head with the width, the date, event name. That's just kind of the preliminary setup. Because everything after that is going to vary depending on what record I have. And this is where our for next loop comes in. And PHP is quite good at this. So the for statement. So for x equals 0, that means it starts at 0. And 0 is always the first record in the array, not 1. And it's going to run as long as x is less than the number of return records that we got. So it's going to increment x by 1 each time it runs. So what this loop does is it starts at 0. It'll run until it increments by 1, and it's going to run until it hits the number of records. So it can't go over the number of records we have and produce some empty record or weird error of some kind. It's like a for next or a while do. Every computer language has got looping stuff like this, and some of it works in different ways, except for, well, actually FileMaker does have a while do now. I just haven't used it, but so x starts at 0, and each time, so x equals 0, it's going to set a variable from record 0. Event date is going to pull the data, the field data for date out of record 0 when x equals 0. It's also going to get the event title from the field data event name for record equals 0. And likewise with the info field. So it's setting up those 3 variables for the first record. And then, this is where Tim will understand it. It's going to echo that entire table row. So it's going to echo table row, table data, and then you can see I've concatenated the variables inside that table data. So you got one table data, it's going to be event date. Then we end that table data. We make a new table data. And I want event title to be in that one. We end that table data. We make a new one. And then it's event info in the big long one. Then we end that table data and we close the tag on that row. So that's one.
Right.
Is that each time for X and however many records there were. At this point, I think we have 4. And when that loop is done, that's when I echo the end table tag.
There you go.
Just building it one thing at a time. And when it's done, it says, okay, I'm done, I'm closed.
There is one small way you could do this that would save you a little bit of code.
Yeah.
If you use a for each in PHP,
Oh,
you
I've
would
heard
say,
of that, yeah.
yeah, you would say like for each data as, and then like item. And then inside, and that would basically, it would already count itself how many things are in the loop. And
Yeah.
instead of having to say like data bracket X $X, you would just say like item arrow field data arrow date every time.
Yeah,
And then you and like 2 or 3 lines and not have to like worry about counting. And
that's true. You wouldn't have to get your return count, although that might be helpful somewhere. But
yeah, no, I think for loops are like really helpful in certain situations, but like this particular instance, I think a for each is a
For
really
each,
good
yeah.
way to go.
No, I think that's a very valid point. Yeah. I didn't even think about that. I'd heard of it, but yeah, I just kind of bounced off of that. But the result is, as you see, I mean, that's back when I only had 2 events. Now we got 4. But how do you get a picture in there? Because I've got event pictures. And just like with, well, this is the data API. I keep trying to kind of differentiate them, but we're really dealing with the same thing here. When you call a container field that has a picture in it, it doesn't send you back that picture. It sends you back a URL for it, for that media. So in this particular case, the event picture is the field that's the container field that has the picture. And when I call that, it sends me back a URL, the streaming SSL main DB, yada, yada, yada. So Tim knows what we have to do with that. Image source, URL a picture. So we just need to modify our PHP code to add a table data column that instead of containing text for the event name, it's got that URL, and it needs to be an image, an IMG tag.
Right.
And because it's got that URL already, it's going to work. It's going to plunk that little picture right in that table.
Bingo.
Let's see. So notes on performance. In your web server, if it's hosted somewhere, it's probably on a really kick-ass internet connection. But if you're going to pull data from a FileMaker server that's in your back office on an old DSL, well, every time somebody accesses your web page, it's got to talk through that old DSL to that old Mac Mini web server or a Mac Mini FileMaker server, and it can affect performance. Kind of depends on what you're doing. If you were going to really, run this kind of solution on a public-facing thing that could be getting thousands of hits per minute, yeah, you're definitely going to want to put your FileMaker server on, probably FileMaker Cloud or something like that. Something with an excellent connection that's not going to have any lag or go down when the neighbor uses their phone or landline or something. I have had a couple of solutions for a couple of years where the PHP is served right off the FileMaker server. These are public facing, but they're not like heavily. They're like customer info pages that get occasional access. So, but I would be really hesitant to do that for, say, that company's main website. I wouldn't want to do that because that could theoretically get hammered. So that's something to bear in mind. It kind of depends on what you're going to do with it. If you're I don't know, if you're like me and you're just doing a, hey, send me a message kind of thing, yeah, that can be hosted on your own web server. But yeah, if you're running a taxi service or trying to do, I don't know, online menus, something that could get thousands of hits, you want to make sure your FileMaker has just as good as access as your web server. And cost, obviously, FileMaker server is required along with the license fee. There is kind of a weird limit here with the user license. Each user license has 2 gigabytes of outbound API data per month for a total of 24 per year. So if you got a 5 user license, you'd be looking at 140 or something gigabytes per year. And that really goes a long ways. It's just kind of the principle, the thing that bugs me. They're trying to sell me my own data. Inbound data, if you were sending data back to the FileMaker server through the API, that does not count against the limit, only outbound text. And also, if you're pulling files like those pictures, the size of the file does not count against that, just of course, the link to the URL, that's text, that counts against the limit. I'm counting on the people I have using this. Data outbound is being measured in megabytes, not gigabytes. And some of these people have 480 gigabytes of outbound data. They're never going to hit it. But in case you did, FileMaker will be glad to sell you more access to your own data. And as far as references, if you're interested, the Claris list of alternatives is there. You should look at that. I felt that was kind of surprising. Just pick that up here. So yeah, it's got the data API can actually, it looks like it can be accessed by a lot of different stuff. .NET, several PHP things, Python, Postman's listed, Ruby, Swift, JavaScript, of course, and C#. So yeah, I mean, there's a little something for everybody, I think.
Everyone appreciate Louis de la Para's work.
Oh yeah, Louis is listed here. Where is he? He's on the JavaScript, I think. No, there he is. Yep. Louis. So if you can figure that out, more power to you. But yeah, .NET. So there's very little excuse to say, well, I can't access FileMaker. Yes, you can. There's all kinds of ways to do it. But I found this particular way, it didn't require anything installed on the server. I just had to make sure curl worked, and I pasted in my functions correctly. And from there, I could pick off anything I want, basically. Let's make sure I got the right one. But yeah, honorable mention, I did try this, and I think, Tim, you had mentioned the RC consulting method.
Yeah.
This was, and I did look into that. I couldn't get it to work. I wish I could have. That was the first thing I tried. But it does require something installed on the server, and it seems like a lot of these things, their first advice is, oh, it's a cinch to install, just install Composer. Okay, how do you get Composer installed? And that's not quite as transparent, but no.
That's a bummer.
I just couldn't get it to work. Probably if I hammered on it for a little while, I probably could, but it looks like pretty much the same deal. Instead of pasting in your functions, it's got some pre-made commands that basically do the same thing. Maybe if you got it installed, it might be slightly easier. I think it's worth a second look, so I wanted to put it in as an honorable mention, but I just couldn't, I couldn't make it work and I got frustrated and went to something else. But
Yeah, they made it sound easy, but I didn't understand, so I don't know.
I think it would have been easy. I just couldn't I couldn't get Composer to work is the problem. So and I
Gotcha.
was trying to do it on my own FileMaker server just for testing, which is not exactly your average web browser. It's or web server, but it's got some things in funky places, and the standard instructions don't always apply. But anyway, but that's what I had. And oh, also because let me share this again. Because this references the regular data API, I included my old data API demo from last year in the demo files. I still refer to that sometimes because there's just some things that are super picky about it. And also because SSL certificates are required, I included my presentation on the Let's Encrypt SSL. Anyone using that, or besides me, or
I had to modify it for Windows,
yeah.
but and well, actually, I got a bunch of help from, I can't remember who they are, but yes.
Cool, yeah. I still use it for 6 or 8 clients a month. I update them every month.